I never thought I'd see my father cry, not when Mom left, not when the ranch started dying around him, not even at his own brother's funeral. But here he was, sitting on the edge of his hospice bed with those calloused hands trembling in his lap, tears cutting clean lines through decades of sun-weathered skin. The afternoon light fell through the window in amber sheets, illuminating the dust motes between us like tiny suspended worlds. He looked at me the way drowning men must look at the surface, desperate and distant at once. His voice, when it finally came, was barely more than a whisper scraped raw by morphine and something heavier than pain. He said there was something I needed to see before he died, something he'd been keeping from me, from everyone, since before I was born. The way he said it made my skin prickle, not with fear exactly, but with the electric awareness that the world I thought I knew was about to crack open like an eggshell. He reached for my hand with fingers that felt like paper and bone, and his grip was surprisingly strong, almost pleading. Outside, the Montana wind moved through the cottonwoods with that lonely sound I'd grown up with, but suddenly even that felt different, charged with significance I couldn't name. He kept saying he was sorry, over and over, like a prayer he'd forgotten how to finish. Sorry for the distance, sorry for the secrets, sorry for being the father who was never quite there even when he was standing right in front of me. I'd spent 30 years building walls against that absence, brick by bitter brick, and now here he was trying to tear them down with words that made no sense. He told me there was something in the barn, the old livestock barn we hadn't used since I was a child, the one he kept padlocked and off limits for reasons he never explained. I remembered being 10 years old and curious, remembered the night I tried to peek through the gaps in the weathered wood and saw a strange blue light pulsing inside like a heartbeat. He'd caught me there, and the look on his face had been pure terror, not anger. He'd never yelled, just led me away with his hand on my shoulder, trembling. That night he'd checked my room 3 times before dawn. I'd convinced myself over the years that I'd imagined that light, that childhood memory was unreliable, that there were reasonable explanations for everything strange. But now, watching his face, as he spoke about the barn, I felt that old childhood certainty returning, cold and electric in my chest. His words came faster now, spilling out like he was racing against his own fading pulse. He said it arrived from the sky in the summer after he and Mom got married, before the ranch failed, before everything turned hard and lonely. He said it changed everything, that nothing in his life made sense before or after except in relation to this impossible thing he'd been hiding. The rational part of my brain was screaming that this was the morphine talking, that dying men see things, believe things, confess to delusions as real as morning. But there was something in his eyes that cut through every reasonable explanation I tried to construct. It wasn't the cloudy confusion of medication or the wandering gaze of dementia. It was clarity, terrible and absolute. The look of a man finally setting down a weight that had been crushing him for decades. He said he needed me to understand, to see, before the government men figured out where to look, because they'd been searching all this time. He said what was in the barn was alive, that it had been alive all these years, waiting. That word, waiting, hung in the air between us like smoke. Waiting for what? I wanted to ask, but my throat had closed around the question. He stood up then, pulling the ivy stand with him, his hospital gown hanging off his shrunken frame like a ghost's costume. He said we had to go now, while there was still light, while he still had strength, while there was still time to show me the truth he'd been carrying alone. Every instinct I had screamed to call the nurse, to ease him back into bed, to protect him from whatever delusion was driving him toward the door. But something older and deeper than instinct made me take his arm, made me help him into his coat, made me walk with him across the gravel drive toward that barn I hadn't entered in 20 years. The padlock was new, but the key was old, worn smooth by countless openings. The metal door scraped open, and the smell that emerged was strange, not unpleasant but utterly foreign, like ozone and copper and something alive but not of any earth I knew. My father stepped inside, and the darkness seemed to shift, seemed to breathe. He called out softly, almost lovingly, in a language I'd never heard him speak, and from the shadows in the back of the barn, something answered, not with words, but with light, that same pulsing blue light from my childhood, now flooding my adult eyes with the unmistakable truth that everything I thought I knew about my father, about the world, about what was possible, had been a comfortable lie. My father's voice pulled me back through time, narrating over the glow that filled the barn like we were watching home movies. Instead of standing before something impossible, August of 1981, he said, the summer that burned everything brown except his hope. He'd been checking fence lines in the high country, miles from anywhere a road could reach, when the sky tore open with a sound like fabric ripping. At a cosmic scale, he thought it was lightning at first, or a meteor, but the trajectory was all wrong, controlled somehow. Desperate, he followed the smoke trail on horseback through pine forests, so thick the sunlight barely touched ground, his heart hammering with the strange certainty that whatever he found would change him. The crash site was a scar in the earth, trees splintered outward in a perfect radius, and at the center was something that hurt to look at directly, not from brightness but from its fundamental wrongness. Against the landscape, the craft, if you could call it that, was maybe the size of a pickup truck, its surface neither metal nor organic but something that seemed to shift between states when you weren't looking at it straight on. It was split open like a seed pod, smoking with colors that didn't have names, and the smell in the air made his teeth ache, and his vision swim. He approached on foot, leading his panicked horse, every survival instinct screaming at him to run, but something deeper, something almost parental, pulled him forward toward the sound of whimpering coming from inside. What he found in the wreckage redefined every boundary he thought existed between possible and impossible, between us and them, between alone and witnessed. It was small, barely the size of a border collie, curled in on itself amid the twisted ruins of technology that looked grown rather than built. Its skin, if that's what you called it, was translucent in places, revealing systems underneath that pulsed with bioluminescence, constellations of light moving through its body like thoughts made visible. The limbs were too long and jointed in too many places, ending in appendages that were part hand, part flower, delicate beyond anything that should survive in this world. But it was the face that stopped his heart, he said, because despite being utterly alien, despite having eyes too large and dark and deep, there was expression there, emotion he recognized with the same certainty he recognized fear in a trapped animal. It was terrified, bleeding something that looked like liquid mercury, shaking with pain or shock or the horrible understanding that it was stranded beyond all hope of return. My father, 26 years old and raised on cattle and silence, made a decision in that moment that would define the rest of his life. He took off his jacket, the denim one with the sheepskin lining that had been his father's, and wrapped it around the creature with hands that had delivered breech calves and mended broken wings. It didn't resist, just looked at him with those endless eyes and made a sound like wind through empty rooms. And somehow, impossibly, he understood that it was asking for help in the only language left when words have no common ground. Getting it back to the ranch without being seen required 3 days of hiking through backcountry, carrying this injured alien wrapped in his coat, while military helicopters combed the mountains with searchlights that turned night into stuttering day. He could hear them on his radio, coded chatter about recovered debris and missing payload and containment protocols, words that made his blood run cold with the understanding of what they'd do if they found what he was hiding. He kept to streams and thick timber, moving at night, feeding the creature water from his canteen which it absorbed through its skin, watching its colors shift from dark, distressed purples to calmer blues as miles passed beneath them. His wife was gone to her sisters that week, a lucky coincidence that felt like fate, and he converted the barn's back room, the one built into the hillside where they used to keep the winter hay, into something between a hospital and his sanctuary. He brought blankets and heat lamps, water and salt and things from the garden, learning through trial and error what it could absorb, what helped, what made those colors pulse with something that might have been gratitude. The wound in its side, a gash that wept mercury and light, slowly began to close over the following weeks, the edges knitting together with a geometry that shouldn't work but did. Through it all, the creature watched him with eyes that seemed to hold entire galaxies, eyes that were beginning to show something beyond fear, something that looked almost like trust, or maybe the beginning of a bond that transcended every natural law he'd ever known. He stopped going to town except when absolutely necessary, stopped answering questions about where he'd been or what he was doing with all that time alone in the barn that used to stand empty. His wife noticed the change, the distraction, the way he'd wake in the night and go out to check on something he'd never explain. But she attributed it to the stress of failing cattle prices and drought, to the depression that seemed to run in his family like a dark river. The creature, recovering slowly in its hidden room, began to move around the space, exploring with cautious curiosity, touching things with those impossible hands and learning the textures of this world it had crashed into. My father would sit with it for hours, talking softly about nothing important, the weather, the ranch, his hopes for children someday. And though it couldn't respond with words, its colors would shift in patterns that felt like listening, like understanding, like the beginning of a conversation that would span decades. He brought it, books with pictures, photographs, maps of the world, and watched as it studied them with an intensity that suggested it was learning not just information but context, culture, the shape of human loneliness. Sometimes it would touch his hand, and he'd feel something like warmth spread up his arm. Not physical heat, but emotional, a sense of being seen completely, known fully, accepted without judgment or expectation. It was during one of these moments, 3 months after the crash, that it first made the gesture that would become their private language, pressing what might have been its palm to what might have been its chest, then extending that appendage toward him, a movement that somehow clearly meant you, me, together, safe, and my father, this taciturn Montana rancher who'd never been good with words even in his own language, pressed his hand to his own heart and nodded, sealing a covenant that would outlast his marriage, his health, and every reasonable choice a man could make. The military presence in the mountains lasted 6 weeks, a siege of helicopters and convoys that turned our remote valley into something from a Cold War fever dream. My father watched them through binoculars from the ridge, counting vehicles, noting patterns, while below in the barn the creature seemed to sense the danger with an instinct that went beyond hearing or sight. During those weeks it would become almost translucent, its bioluminescence dimming to nearly nothing, as if it could make itself less real, less detectable, through sheer will. He'd find it pressed into corners, trembling with colors that pulsed dark red and deep purple, hues he'd come to understand meant fear and something else, something like grief or homesickness so profound it had physical weight. On the worst days, when the choppers came closest, flying search grids that brought them directly over the ranch, the creature would reach for him with those impossible hands and he'd hold it the way you'd hold a frightened child, feeling its rapid heartbeat, or what passed for a heartbeat, thrumming against his chest in rhythms that seemed to echo the magnetic pull of distant stars. His wife asked once why he spent so much time in the barn. What could possibly be so important out there in the empty hay room? And he'd looked at her with eyes full of a truth he could never speak and said simply that he was building something, which was not entirely a lie. He was building trust across a gulf wider than space, constructing a bridge between species with nothing but patience and presence. And every day that the creature didn't die, didn't get discovered, didn't vanish back into impossibility, felt like a small miracle he was terrified to examine too closely. As autumn came and the military finally pulled back, declaring the search concluded with only scattered debris recovered, the creature began to change in ways that suggested healing went deeper than the physical. It started to move through the barn with more confidence, exploring the tools hanging on walls, the old tack, the hay bales stacked against winter, touching everything with a curiosity that seemed almost joyful. My father brought it things from the house when his wife was asleep, objects that might teach or comfort, a radio that it listened to with obvious fascination, tilting its head at angles that shouldn't be possible, a child's book of constellations that it studied for hours, making small sounds of recognition or maybe longing, a mirror in which it examined itself, with what looked unmistakably like sadness. He began to understand that it was intelligent in ways that made human cleverness seem like a pale shadow, that behind those dark eyes was a mind that processed reality through dimensions he couldn't perceive, that it was probably lonely in ways he couldn't imagine, stranded not just on the wrong planet, but in the wrong universe of understanding. One night in October, the first snow already dusting the high peaks, it did something that changed everything between them. It reached out and touched his temple with one delicate appendage, and suddenly his mind was full of images that weren't memories, visions that came from outside his own experience. A world of impossible colors orbiting a star that burned violet, structures that grew like crystals from living stone, beings like this one moving in murals of light and gesture through atmospheres that would kill him instantly. The vision lasted maybe 3 seconds but felt like hours, and when it ended he was crying without knowing why, overwhelmed by beauty and loss in equal measure, understanding for the first time what it had sacrificed by surviving. After that first intentional vision, the creature became bolder in its attempts to communicate, to share not just information but feeling, context, the architecture of its inner life. It would show him fragments of what might have. Then its departure, the urgency and fear, colors that seemed to indicate warning or escape, suggestions that it had left not on a mission but in desperation. Sometimes the visions were abstract, emotional landscapes rather than literal images, waves of colors that he learned to interpret. Gold meant curiosity, silver was contentment, the deep blue that reminded him of twilight seemed to mean something like gratitude or affection. He started responding in kind, speaking less and instead trying to project feelings, thinking hard about safety and protection while maintaining eye contact, and he'd swear the creature understood, its colors shifting to match his intentions like a conversation in light. The bond between them deepened through that winter as snow buried the ranch, and his wife grew more distant, sensing something had changed in him, some fundamental shift she couldn't name, but felt in the growing silence between them. He spent longer hours in the barn, sometimes sleeping there on cold nights when he told himself he was checking on the heater but really just wanted to be near this impossible thing that had crashed into his life and split it into before and after. The creature seemed to need his presence too, would become agitated if he stayed away too long, its colors flickering anxiously until he returned, and in those moments of reunion, when it would press its strange hand to his chest in their gesture of connection, he felt less alone than he had in his entire life. By the time spring broke through the mountain winter, my father had become two people, the one who went through the motions of ranching and marriage, and the one who lived his real life in a converted barn room with a being from beyond the stars. He'd learned to read its moods by color and posture, knew when it needed solitude and when it craved connection, brought it things from the world that seemed to bring comfort, plants from the garden that it would touch gently, absorbing something from them that made it glow brighter, recordings of music that made its colors dance, and once, memorably, a kitten from the barn cats that it held with such careful tenderness he understood it had known gentleness before, had loved and been loved in whatever incomprehensible context love took on its distant world. The creature's wound had fully healed by then, leaving only a pattern of silver traces across its side like lightning frozen in flesh, and it had grown slightly, or perhaps just grown more solid, more present, more committed to existence in this strange exile. Sometimes he'd catch it standing at the small window he'd installed, looking up at the night sky with an expression he couldn't read but felt in his chest like homesickness, and he'd wonder if it was waiting for rescue or had already accepted that none would come. On those nights he'd sit beside it in silence, two beings from different corners of existence, bound by accident and choice, and feel the weight of what he'd done, the magnitude of this secret that grew heavier with each passing season, knowing he could never let it go, never surrender this trust, this strange and sacred friendship that had reformed him at a level deeper than bone, teaching him that loneliness was not a human condition but a universal one, and that connection, once truly found, was worth protecting against any force that would sever it. The years folded into each other like pages in a book written in fading ink, and the creature became the axis round which my father's diminishing world turned. By 1985 his marriage had collapsed under the weight of secrets he couldn't share, my mother leaving with me in tow, sensing but never naming the thing that had stolen her husband's attention, that made him a ghost in his own house even when his body occupied the rooms they'd once shared with hope for the future. He didn't fight her departure, couldn't explain what kept him chained to this isolated ranch, when better opportunities existed elsewhere, when friends and family asked why he stayed in such deliberate solitude, cutting himself off from community and connection like a monk devoted to some unspeakable faith. The creature witnessed his grief during those months, its colors muted to sympathetic purples and grays, and one night when he sat on the barn floor weeping for the family he'd chosen to lose, it approached and placed both its hands on either side of his face, sharing a vision of its own world burning, cities of crystal, light collapsing into violet flames, beings like itself scattering into the void in desperate exodus, and he understood it was offering its own loss as companionship to his, saying in the only language they shared that grief recognized itself across any distance, that he was understood in his suffering, that neither of them was meant for the lives they now inhabited, but here they were, surviving together. The communication between them evolved into something more sophisticated than those early emotional exchanges, developing into a hybrid language of gesture, color, and transmitted feeling that allowed for nuance and complexity he hadn't thought possible. The creature learned to interpret his words even if it couldn't speak them, would respond to questions with specific color patterns they'd established through patient repetition, Gold flickering twice meant yes. Silver flowing downward meant no. Combinations of hues created concepts like danger or hunger or the particular shade of blue-green that meant it wanted him to share human. Music, which had become one of its deepest fascinations. He brought a better radio and later a tape player, watching its colors dance to everything from Mozart to Johnny Cash, noting that it seemed to prefer songs about loneliness and distance, ballads of longing that crossed cultural barriers because longing was apparently universal, encoded into consciousness itself regardless of planet or biology. On clear nights he'd open the barn fully, and they'd sit together looking at stars, and it would touch his temple, and show him which point of light had been its sun, a star he'd never noticed among the thousands, scattered across the Montana sky, so distant its light had traveled longer than human civilization had existed, and the scale of that separation, the impossible gulf between here and there, would make him dizzy with a sorrow that felt almost holy, almost like prayer offered to an empty cosmos that had somehow still answered, if only through accident and catastrophe. The creature began sharing more deliberate knowledge as trust deepened into something resembling family, teaching him things about the universe that contradicted everything he'd learned in school, but felt true in ways that bypassed logic and spoke directly to intuition. It showed him visions of how its people perceived time, not as a linear river, but as a vast ocean where past and future existed simultaneously, where choice created branches rather than singular paths. And for weeks after these transmissions, he'd move through his days haunted by the sensation of living multiple lives at once, feeling phantom versions of himself making different decisions in parallel existences he could almost but not quite perceive. It revealed through careful, repeated imagery that its ship hadn't crashed by accident, but had been damaged in some kind of conflict it couldn't fully explain. Colors that suggested fear and betrayal and desperate flight, implications that not all of its kind were peaceful, that perhaps it was a refugee or deserter or something his human categories couldn't properly contain. He realized he'd been naive to imagine all alien consciousness as uniformly benevolent, that intelligence didn't guarantee wisdom or kindness, and the fact that this particular being had chosen gentleness, had responded to his care with affection rather than manipulation or violence, felt less like inevitability and more like grace, like a gift he'd stumbled into accepting without understanding its value until now, years deep into an intimacy that had replaced every other relationship in his contracting life. By the time the 1990s arrived and I'd become a teenager he rarely saw, the creature had lived in his barn for longer than most marriages lasted, had been his daily companion through the kind of isolation that would have driven most people to madness, or at least back to civilization's comfort. It had watched him age from a young man into middle years, had witnessed his hair gray and his body slow, and sometimes he wondered what his lifespan looked like from its perspective, whether humans seemed like mayflies to a species that might live for centuries, whether it was consciously choosing to spend its exile with a being whose entire existence would flicker past in what might be, to its people, a brief afternoon. But the sorrow in its colors when he was sick or injured suggested it understood mortality, feared his death perhaps more than he did, and he'd catch it watching him with an intensity that felt like memorization, as if it was storing every detail of his face and movements against a future loss. It could already perceive approaching. They'd developed rituals over the years, small ceremonies of connection. Every evening he'd bring dinner and they'd eat together, it absorbing nutrients from raw vegetables in ways that still mystified him while he ate his simple meals, and afterward it would rest its head against his shoulder in a posture of such pure trust and contentment that he'd feel his throat tighten with emotions he had no names for. Love, but not like any love he'd known. Devotion mixed with wonder, mixed with the peculiar grief of knowing this perfect, impossible friendship was also a kind of mutual imprisonment they'd both chosen and could never escape. The phone call came on a February morning in 2018. My stepmother's voice, tight with something between panic and resignation, telling me I needed to come home because my father was dying and there was something he needed to show me before the end. I'd built a life in Seattle that deliberately excluded this place, had constructed an identity round urban progressivism and rational skepticism that left no room for the rural mysticism I associated with his isolation. The weird hermit he'd become after driving my mother away, with whatever obsession had colonized his mind during my childhood. The drive back across Montana felt like traveling into a past I'd spent decades escaping, each mile stripping away the protective layers of education and cynicism I'd wrapped around myself, and by the time I reached the ranch I hadn't visited in 5 years, I was already angry, already armored against whatever final disappointment or delusion he'd summoned me to witness. He met me at the house looking like death's rough draft, his body eaten hollow by the cancer he'd apparently hidden for months. But his eyes burned with an urgency that stopped my prepared speech of minimal sympathy. And when he said we needed to go to the barn before we talked about anything else, that there was something impossible I had to see, I felt childhood fear move through me like cold water, remembering how that structure had always been forbidden, always locked, the source of whispered arguments between my parents that stopped when I entered rooms. The barn doors opening released a scent I couldn't categorize, something like ozone and copper and growing things, and the interior was darker than the February afternoon outside. My eyes struggling to adjust while my father's hand gripped my arm with surprising strength, guiding me forward while he whispered that I shouldn't be afraid, that it had been waiting decades to meet me, that everything strange about our family's history was about to make terrible, beautiful sense. Then I saw it standing in the space he'd clearly prepared for this revelation, and my entire construction of reality underwent violent, immediate collapse. The creature was perhaps 4 feet tall, its skin shifting through colors I had no names for, surfaces that seemed to exist partially outside normal space, and its eyes, God, its eyes, were enormous and dark and filled with such profound intelligence and sorrow, that I actually stumbled backward, my mind rejecting and accepting simultaneously what stood impossible before me. It didn't move toward me, but instead raised one long-fingered hand, in a gesture that was somehow universally recognizable as greeting, as peaceful intention, and I felt tears streaming down my face without understanding why, my body responding to something my rational mind was still scrambling to categorize, to fit into frameworks that were already disintegrating under the weight of its presence. My father was saying something about 1981, about a crash and decades of hiding, but his words barely registered because the creature had tilted its head in a manner that conveyed curiosity and compassion, and I realized it was reading me, perceiving my shock and fear and the hairline fractures spreading through my understanding of what was real, what was possible, what my father's entire isolated existence had actually been protecting. It moved then, slowly, and with obvious care not to frighten me further, approaching until it stood just beyond arm's reach, and I found myself unable to retreat, paralyzed by something stronger than fear, something like recognition despite having never imagined such a being could exist outside science fiction and fevered dreams. My father's voice was thick with emotion as he explained that it had been his companion longer than he'd been married, that it had shared his isolation and understood his sacrifices, and I felt a spike of irrational jealousy that this thing had known versions of my father I'd never met, had occupied the space in his heart that should have belonged to family, to me. But then the creature extended its hand toward my face, not quite touching, and I felt my father's hand on my shoulder encouraging me, giving permission, and when I didn't pull away its fingers made contact with my temple and the barn disappeared into vision. I saw my father young and terrified, dragging a broken body from twisted metal, saw him making the choice to hide rather than report, to protect rather than profit from discovery. And I saw myself as a child burning with fever in fragmented hospital memories I'd forgotten, saw this impossible being standing over my bed glowing with colors that meant healing, means effort, saw my father weeping with gratitude as my temperature dropped and the infection the doctors couldn't identify simply vanished, and I understood with crushing clarity that I owed my life to this creature, that its existence had shaped mine in ways I'd never suspected, that the distance between my father and me had been built on a secret that was also a gift, protection disguised as neglect. When the vision released me, I was on my knees without remembering falling, my father's hands supporting me while the creature stepped back with what I somehow recognized as concern, its colors shifting toward cooler tones that communicated apology and necessity, that this sharing had been required despite its violence to my unprepared consciousness. I was gasping like I'd surfaced from deep water, my mind trying to process not just what I'd seen, but the implications spiraling outward from those images, the revision of my entire history they demanded. And when I could finally speak, I asked the question that seemed most urgent through my shock. Why had it stayed? Why hadn't it tried to go home, to signal for rescue across whatever impossible distance separated it from its origin? The creature tilted its head in that gesture I was already learning to read as contemplation, then moved toward a corner of the barn where my father had clearly constructed something like living quarters, walls covered in symbols and diagrams that looked like mathematics translated into art. And centered among them was a device I hadn't noticed before, something organic and technological simultaneously, pulsing with faint light that seemed to breathe. My father explained that it had been building this for years, that he'd helped gather materials and construct the housing, and for decades he'd believed it was exactly what I'd assumed, a beacon calling for rescue, a lighthouse guiding its people home, to retrieve their lost explorer. But his voice cracked as he continued, saying that only recently, as his illness progressed and secrets seemed less sustainable, had the creature finally revealed the signal's true purpose, the message it had been sending into the vast darkness between stars. The being approached the device and placed both hands against its surface, and suddenly I was inside another vision, though gentler this time, more controlled, images and emotions flowing rather than crashing through my consciousness. I saw its world dying, saw the desperation that had driven its people to explore farther and more recklessly than wisdom recommended, saw the crash that had stranded it here not as tragedy, but as escape from a civilization consuming itself and its final generations, and I understood that it had no desire to return to that ending, that Earth, despite its violence and confusion, had become something its dying world could never be again, home. But the vision didn't stop there, instead showing me what it had learned during its decades observing humanity through my father's life, through news and books and the slow education in our species' capacity for both transcendence and atrocity, and I felt its profound ambivalence, its recognition that we were simultaneously the most dangerous and most beautiful thing it had encountered, capable of protecting a stranger at enormous personal cost while building weapons to destroy ourselves 1,000 times over. The signal wasn't calling its people here, the vision revealed, but warning them away, broadcasting coordinates marked as dangerous, as containing an unstable species that might reach the stars before learning wisdom, that might carry violence beyond its own atmosphere. And I felt the creature's sorrow, that the species capable of my father's decades of selfless protection was also capable of turning that same capacity for loyalty into tribalism and fear. The message contained everything it had learned about us, all the beauty and horror meticulously documented, a warning wrapped in love, a quarantine built from hope that we might survive our own adolescence, if given time to mature in isolation. And I understood that this being had sacrificed any chance of rescue to protect both its own people and ours from a contact neither was ready to survive. When I emerged from the vision, I found myself weeping again, but differently now, mourning something I couldn't quite name, some lost possibility or innocence I'd never actually possessed but felt the absence of nonetheless. The creature was watching me with those impossibly expressive eyes, and I recognized that it was seeking understanding, perhaps forgiveness, for having made such a profound judgment about the species I belonged to, for seeing both the man who'd protected it for decades and the civilization that would dissect it without hesitation if given the chance. My father was sitting heavily on a hay bale, looking ancient and exhausted, and when I asked how long he'd known the signal's true purpose, he said only months, that the revelation had been part of why he'd finally decided to break the secret, why he'd called me home despite knowing this knowledge would shatter the comfortable boundaries of my carefully constructed skepticism. The barn suddenly felt too small to contain what we three represented: human and alien, father and daughter, protector and protected. Warning and hope intertwined so completely that separating them would destroy both, and through the gaps in the barn walls I could see the Montana sky deepening toward evening, vast and indifferent, and suddenly filled with implications I'd never considered before. Every star a possible home to beings making calculations about whether to reach toward us or away. The creature moved close to me again, extending its hand palm up in a gesture that somehow transcended species, an offering of connection, and when I placed my hand against its strange skin, I felt warmth and something like recognition, acknowledgement that we were both children of imperfect worlds, both trying to navigate the impossible space between love and fear, between reaching out and protecting ourselves from what contact might cost. Part of me wanted to rage against its judgment, to defend humanity's potential against its documented failures, but the vision had been too honest, too filled with evidence I couldn't dispute. Images of my father's goodness existing alongside news footage of atrocities the creature had witnessed through the television my father watched, through newspapers and books, and the slow education in our contradictions. Instead, I asked what it hoped for. What outcome justified decades of isolation and the grief of permanent exile? And the answer came not as vision, but as emotion transmitted through our joined hands. It hoped we would surprise it, would prove its warning premature, would somehow find the wisdom to match our technological advancement before we carried our unresolved violence beyond our atmosphere. And it was willing to wait out its entire lifespan in this barn to give us that chance, to delay the contact that might save it, but doom both our species to conflict neither could afford. My father said something about faith, about the creature having chosen to believe in our potential despite all evidence, having made a bet on human goodness based on a sample size of one Montana rancher who'd chosen protection over profit on an August night in 1981. And I heard the weight of that responsibility in his voice. The decades of trying to be worthy of a trust he'd never asked for, but couldn't betray. The device, in the corner, pulsed its steady rhythm, sending its warning into the void, broadcasting coordinates marked with love and danger in equal measure. And I understood that my father had been its guardian, not just physically, but symbolically, proof of concept that humans could choose wisely when it mattered, that we contained multitudes and might yet choose which elements of our nature to carry forward into whatever future awaited us among the stars. The helicopters arrived with dawn, their rotors beating the air into submission before the sound resolved into recognition. That distinctive thrumming I'd heard in war movies, but never expected to feel vibrating through my rib cage as I stood in my father's kitchen watching coffee brew like this was a normal morning, like I hadn't spent the night having my understanding of reality systematically demolished and rebuilt into something unrecognizable. My father heard them before I did, some rancher's instinct attuned to wrongness in the natural soundscape, and when our eyes met across the kitchen I saw something I'd never witnessed in him before, not fear exactly, but a kind of resigned dread, the expression of a man who'd known this moment was inevitable and had simply hoped to die before its arrival. We moved together without discussion toward the barn, and the creature was already standing at the window slit when we entered, its color shifting through patterns I was learning to read as alarm, its body rigid with tension that transcended language, and through the gaps in the weathered wood I could see them landing in the eastern pasture, black helicopters settling like predatory birds, while vehicles poured up the access road in a convoy that must have been staged miles away, waiting for some signal or authorization to finally close a case that had been opened since 1981. My father's hand found my shoulder and gripped hard enough to hurt, an anchor or a plea. And when he spoke, his voice carried 40 years of dreading this convergence. They'd found us. They'd finally traced whatever electromagnetic signature the beacon produced. And every nightmare he'd imagined during for decades of protection was about to manifest in his front yard with the force of federal authority and military precision behind it. Within minutes the property was surrounded, black SUVs forming a perimeter, while figures in tactical gear took positions that would have seemed absurd if they weren't so terrifyingly competent. Weapons trained on a barn that contained nothing more threatening than hay and an old man, and an alien being that had spent 40 years doing nothing but hiding and hoping humanity might outgrow its worst instincts. A voice amplified through speakers demanded my father exit the structure, hands visible, language carefully neutral, but inflected with the kind of authority that expected compliance, not because it was reasonable, but because resistance was unthinkable. And I felt the creature move behind me, its presence suddenly more real than it had been even during the visions, transformed from impossible miracle to tangible being whose safety was measured in the restraint of the armed men surrounding us. My father didn't move toward the door, instead positioning himself between the creature and the barn's entrance, his shoulders squared despite the tremor in his hands, despite the cancer eating him from the inside, despite being 73 years old and facing what looked like enough firepower to level a small country. And when he spoke, it was quietly. To me and to the being he'd protected longer than I'd been alive, they'd have to come through him. He said they'd have to take by force what he'd never surrender voluntarily, because some things mattered more than survival. Some truths were more important than compliance with authority that understood nothing about what they were demanding. I started to argue, to point out the insanity of resistance, but the creature touched my arm and I fell silent, feeling through that contact its complex response, gratitude and sorrow in something like resignation, an ancient consciousness that had watched its own world die, understanding exactly how this would end, that my father's defiance was beautiful and futile in equal measure. The voice outside shifted tactics, identified my father by name, acknowledged his military service and standing in the community, offered assurances about peaceful resolution and scientific inquiry, words clearly crafted by someone trained in negotiation but delivered with an edge that suggested patience had limits, and force was always option 2, waiting just behind the reasonable facade. My father called back through the barn walls that they could make any promises they wanted, that he'd lived long enough to know the gap between official assurances and reality, that he'd seen what governments did with things they wanted to study, and his voice carried not anger, but an awful certainty. For decades of imagining this moment crystallized into absolute conviction that surrender meant betrayal, that opening these doors would be the final and unforgivable failure of his self-appointed guardianship. The creature moved to stand beside him, and I watched something pass between them that needed no translation, a communication built over years of shared isolation. And when my father looked at me, his eyes held an appeal. I understood instinctively. He was asking me to witness, to remember, to carry forward whatever happened here into whatever came after, because the story mattered even if the ending was already written in the positions of armed men and the mathematics of force. Through the barn walls I could hear engines idling, radio chatter, the mechanical sounds of authority preparing to escalate, and the morning light streaming through the gaps turned the dust motes into golden suspension, beautiful and indifferent, illuminating the space where three beings from different worlds made their stand against the inevitable, against the machinery of governments and the human inability to let mysteries remain unsolved. And I understood that my father had been preparing for this ending since that August night in 1981, that every day of protection had been borrowed time, grace extended until the bill finally came due with interest compounded by decades of official frustration and institutional determination to secure what they'd been seeking since before I was born. The standoff crystallized into terrible clarity when a man emerged from the lead vehicle, older than the tactical team, wearing a suit that looked expensive even at this distance, speaking into a handheld microphone with the measured cadence of someone accustomed to being obeyed, and his words carried across the morning air with bureaucratic precision. They had authority extend into the highest levels of government. They had documentation and legal justifications, and they would prefer cooperation but were prepared for alternatives. Subtext and threat braided together in language designed to sound reasonable, while communicating absolute determination. My father's response was to step fully into the barn's doorway, making himself visible, making himself the obstacle they'd have to overcome. And behind him the creature stood in shadow, its form just visible enough to confirm what they'd come for, what they'd been searching for across decades of dead ends and false leads. And I saw through the weapon's sights and official authority to the essential truth underneath. This was about power and control and the human inability to allow anything to exist beyond our understanding, our documentation, our possession. The creature's hand found mine in the shadows, and I felt it transmitting something complex. Not quite forgiveness for my species, but a kind of sad recognition that this was always how it would end, that my father's protection was the aberration and this militarized response the norm, that the same capacity for individual goodness existed within systems designed for control and violence, and that perhaps the warning it had broadcast was justified not by human evil, but by this exactly, our inability to encounter the unknown with anything but weapons drawn and demands for surrender, our transformation of wonder into threat assessment and miracle into security protocol requiring containment. My father's voice cut through the amplified demands with sudden force, not shouting but projecting with the command of someone who'd led men in combat decades before. These tactical teams were born, and he told them something I'd never heard, never known, a confession that transformed the standoff into something infinitely more complex. The creature had saved his life in the winter of 1984, when a blizzard trapped him 3 miles from home, with a broken leg and dropping temperatures that should have killed him within hours, had found him somehow through the whiteout conditions and carried him back to the barn using strength that belied its fragile appearance, had maintained his body temperature through that endless night with its own diminishing heat, until morning came, and survival became possible instead of statistical improbability. The words hung in the air, between armed authority and desperate protection, reframing the narrative, from government pursuing alien specimen to something more complicated, debt and gratitude complicating the clean lines of institutional prerogative. And I saw the suited man pause mid-instruction, saw the tactical teams exchange glances that suggested this wasn't in their briefing materials, wasn't part of the scenario they'd trained for during whatever preparation preceded this operation. But my father wasn't finished, and his next words hit me like physical impact, rewriting my own history even as he spoke it. The creature had healed me when I was 7 years old, when what everyone thought was childhood flu was actually something catastrophic, organ failure that no rural hospital could have treated in time. And he'd brought me to the barn in desperation while my mother was sleeping, had watched the creature place its hands on my fevered body and somehow, impossibly, repair what was breaking, sending me back to bed with no memory of the intervention that saved my life, giving me decades I should never have had, making me living evidence that the being they wanted to secure and study and contain had already proven itself capable of the kind of compassion that transcended species and survival instinct. I felt the memory trying to surface, not complete, but fragmentary, dream images of strange lights, and my father's terrified face and a presence that should have been frightening but wasn't. Sensations I'd always attributed to fever hallucinations suddenly recontextualized as actual experience, and my hand moved involuntarily to my abdomen, where presumably some catastrophic failure had been occurring 26 years ago, where alien intervention had rewritten what should have been my death into continued existence. The creature squeezed my hand gently, confirming what my father had revealed, and through that contact I felt its memory of that night, my small body convulsing with systemic failure, my father's desperate pleading, its own decision to risk exposure and energy depletion to save the child of the one human who'd shown it kindness, an act of reciprocal protection that bound our fates together. Before I was old enough to understand the binding, the suited man had moved closer during my father's revelation, was now near enough that I could see his expression processing this information, calculating how it complicated their mission parameters, whether individual acts of life-saving altered the institutional imperative to secure potential threat and strategic asset. And when he spoke again, his voice carried less certainty, more consideration. They understood the personal connections, appreciated the complex history, but their mandate extended beyond individual circumstance to national security and scientific priority. Words that meant nothing was changed despite everything being different. My father's shoulders sagged slightly, not defeat but recognition, the understanding that he'd played his only card, and it wasn't enough, that gratitude and debt and love didn't register on the scales that balanced government decisions, that the armed men surrounding us would follow orders regardless of the moral complexity underlying their mission. And I felt the absolute futility of individual goodness confronting institutional machinery, designed to process exactly this kind of resistance into compliance through overwhelming force and legal authority. The creature stepped forward then, moving past my father despite his attempt to block its path, and I felt through our maintained contact its decision crystallizing. Choice made not from defeat but from something like grace, the recognition that further resistance only endangered the humans it had come to love, that my father's gesture of protection was enough regardless of outcome, that being willing to stand between it and authority was the gift, not the success of that standing. It moved into fuller light where the tactical teams could see it completely, hands raised in what might have been species' universal gesture of peaceful intent, its colors shifting to patterns I was learning to read as complex emotion, sorrow and resignation, but also something like gratitude, determination threaded through acceptance that this was how the story ended, with voluntary surrender instead of forcing my father to watch them take by violence what he'd protected through decades of isolation and fear. My father made a sound I'd never heard from him, something between protest and grief, lurching forward to pull the creature back into shadow and safety. But it turned to face him and placed one elongated hand against his weathered cheek, and the gesture carried such tenderness that I felt my throat close, witnessed intimacy that transcended every difference between them, affection built through 40 years of shared silence and mutual protection, and I understood I was watching a goodbye that shouldn't have to happen, but was happening anyway, because the world wasn't built to allow this kind of connection to exist outside institutional control and government prerogative. The contact between them extended for seconds that felt suspended, outside normal time, and I knew somehow that the creature was sharing a final vision with my father, some communication that needed no translation. And when it stepped back, his face was wet with tears that carved channels through decades of weathered stoicism, his hand remaining extended toward where the creature had stood, reaching for what was already lost despite still being visible. And I realized that love and protection, even when they failed to prevent the inevitable, were never wasted. That my father's 40 years of guardianship mattered absolutely regardless of this ending. That the creature's choice to surrender rather than watch him hurt was its own form of protection. Reciprocal grace exchanged in the space between defiance and submission, making them both guardian and guarded simultaneously. The creature walked toward the barn door with steady purpose despite what must have been terror, and I moved with it without conscious decision, my hand still clasped in its strange grip. My father on its other side, three beings processing grief and love in the shadow of overwhelming force. And when we emerged into morning light, the tactical teams tensed but held fire, their discipline evident in restraint that must have required training, and trust in command structure. And the suited man stepped forward with expression suggesting this wasn't how he'd expected acquisition to proceed, that voluntary surrender. Complicated narratives of dangerous entity requiring containment through necessary force. The creature stopped several yards from the nearest vehicle, positioned between my father and approaching authority, and turned to look at both of us with eyes that held intelligence and sorrow that made mockery of every alien invasion movie, every narrative of inhuman threat, carrying instead the weight of consciousness that had watched its own world die and found strange salvation in 40 years of hiding in a Montana barn, protected by species it had every reason to fear, loved by man it had saved in return, making family from isolation until family was all that remained. My father gripped my shoulder and I gripped the creature's hand, and we stood there in configuration that must have looked absurd from tactical positions and government perspectives. Three figures silhouetted against weathered barn while armed men waited for resolution, and I felt through maintained contact the creature's final communication, wordless but absolute, that my father's protection had been everything, that the years of hiding were gift not imprisonment, that it had known love in this strange exile, and that love was the only truth that survived. When worlds died and species fell and governments drew weapons against what they didn't understand, the single constant that made existence bearable and isolation meaningful, and this ending, however painful, somehow acceptable because it was chosen freely rather than taken by force, offered as final protection for the human who'd offered first protection 40 years ago in decision that changed 3 lives across the mathematics of species difference and the geometry of impossible connection. The suited man reached us with movements that suggested protocol being rewritten in real time, his approach calibrated to avoid triggering protective instinct in my father, while acknowledging the creature's voluntary positioning, and when he spoke his voice carried unexpected gentleness, perhaps recognition that coercion was unnecessary when surrender had already been offered. Perhaps something in our configuration of grief had penetrated professional detachment. They would transport the being to a secure facility where scientists could ensure its health and safety, words that meant examination and study but were framed as care. Institutional euphemism softening what we all understood was irreversible separation from the only home and family it had known for decades. The creature turned its head toward me then, and I felt sudden urgency in our contact, information being transmitted with intensity that suggested final opportunity, and images flooded my consciousness with overwhelming clarity, not just memories of its dying world or reasons it could never return, but something more immediate, more crucial, the truth it had withheld even from my father during their 40 years together, because the knowledge would have brought different dangers than government discovery. Through cascading visions I understood that the signals it had been broadcasting weren't distress calls or attempts at rescue, but warnings transmitted across impossible distances to whatever remained of its species, messages that repeated single urgent imperative: stay away, avoid this world, do not seek the lost one, because humanity was not ready, because first contact would trigger exactly the kind of armed response now surrounding us, because love between species was rare miracle but fear and violence were statistical certainties, and it had been protecting both its kind and mine through strategic silence, through accepting permanent exile to prevent cascade of consequences that would follow if others came searching. The revelation stunned me with its implications, transformed 40 years of hiding from desperate self-preservation into deliberate sacrifice, the creature choosing isolation and loneliness over reunion that might endanger the humans who'd shown it kindness. And I understood that my father's protection had been matched and exceeded by protection flowing in reverse direction, the creature becoming guardian of entire species through its decision to remain unfound, broadcasting warnings instead of coordinates, accepting that it would die alone and forgotten rather than risk the chaos that would follow. If its people attempted retrieval or retaliation or simple investigation of world that had swallowed one of their own, my father saw my expression change, read shock and understanding in features that must have reflected the weight of what I was learning, and he moved closer, his hand finding my free shoulder. What was it showing me? What final truth was being transmitted in these last moments of contact? And I struggled to articulate revelation that felt too large for words, too complex for the armed standoff context surrounding us. I managed fragments, disconnected phrases about warnings and protection and sacrifice, and watched comprehension dawn across his weathered face. Watched him turn toward the creature with expression transforming from grief to something approaching awe, the recognition that his 40 years of guardianship had been reciprocated on scale he'd never imagined, that the being he'd hidden and protected had been simultaneously hiding and protecting him, his family, his entire species through broadcasts that said stay away, through accepting exile that prevented cascading first contact disasters, through loving humanity enough to spare it from its own worst reactive impulses by ensuring his people never came looking. The creature's color shifted to patterns I was learning meant affirmation and sorrow combined, confirmation that my father's understanding was correct, that their bond had always been mutual protection even when he hadn't known the full scope of what was being protected, and it reached toward him with deliberate movement, touching his weathered face one final time with gentleness that carried for decades of wordless conversation and shared isolation, and reciprocal salvation, transferring final vision that I felt secondhand through our maintained contact, that love and protection, even across species and stars, even when imperfect and incomplete and ultimately unable to prevent separation, was the only truth that mattered, the single constant that survived when governments intervened and worlds died, and exile became permanent, making meaning from isolation and family from difference and connection from the vast empty spaces between understanding, the transfer completed and the creature stepped back, releasing both our hands simultaneously, and I felt the absence of contact like sudden cold, the loss of direct communication leaving me isolated in my own consciousness after brief window into intelligence that processed reality through entirely different architecture, and my father's face was wet again, with tears that he no longer tried to hide, his hand still extended toward where the creature had touched him, and I knew he'd received vision more complete than my second-hand version, final gift of understanding to carry forward when physical presence was gone. The creature turned toward the suited man and waiting tactical teams with posture that conveyed readiness, acceptance, and the kind of dignity that comes from choosing sacrifice rather than having it imposed. And as government personnel moved forward with equipment and restraints that hopefully were gentler than they appeared, my father spoke one last time, voice rough with emotion but steady with certainty, the creature's name, if beings who communicated through color and touch and vision could be said to have names translatable to human language, was Kale, which in the limited vocabulary they developed together meant keeper of light, and he wanted them to know they weren't taking anonymous specimen or generic alien entity, but specific individual who'd saved his life, healed his daughter, spent 40 years sending warnings to protect species that would inevitably capture and study it, who deserved recognition as person rather than thing, regardless of how different its personhood appeared. The suited man paused, met my father's eyes with expression suggesting unexpected respect, and repeated the name carefully, committing it to whatever report would follow, and I saw Kel's color shift to pattern that might have been gratitude, acknowledgement that even in capture there was grace in being named, and recognized and understood as conscious being rather than biological curiosity, and as they led it toward waiting vehicles I felt the weight of what we were losing, not just individual but bridge between worlds, proof that connection was possible across every difference if fear could be overcome, and protection offered without expectation of return. The vehicles departed as sun cleared the mountain ridge, dust rising behind black SUVs that carried away 40 years of secret history and impossible friendship. And my father and I stood in settling silence watching until even dust dispersed into morning air, leaving only empty dirt road and knowledge that nothing would ever be the same, that the barn behind us was now tomb for vanished miracle rather than sanctuary for ongoing one, that we were suddenly and absolutely alone in a way we hadn't been minutes before, even though I'd only learned of Kel's existence hours earlier, the absence somehow more profound than for decades of my ignorance had been. My father turned toward me finally, and I saw in his face the cost of 40 years of secrecy and protection, The toll of loving something he could never fully understand while knowing. Discovery would mean exactly what had just occurred, and I moved to embrace him without words because words were inadequate for what we'd witnessed, and lost and learned. And he held me with grip that trembled with exhaustion and grief and perhaps relief that secret was finally shared, even if sharing had come through the worst possible circumstances. That in these final hours he'd had witness to connection he'd maintained in isolation, that I'd seen and touched and understood what he'd protected before it was taken beyond our reach. We stood there as morning established itself around us, two humans processing loss that shouldn't have been possible because the relationship that preceded it shouldn't have existed. And through my grief I felt strange gratitude that my father had been brave enough or crazy enough, or compassionate enough to offer shelter to crashed being 40 years ago, that his decision had given Cale decades of something like home, that their impossible friendship had existed at all even if existence was now past tense, terminated by institutional machinery that recognized only threat and asset rather than consciousness and connection. And I understood that my father's choice to protect had been the right one regardless of outcome, that the 40 years of hiding were worth the ending, that love was its own justification even when love couldn't prevent eventual loss. The government questioned us separately and extensively over the following weeks. Clinical interviews conducted in sterile rooms that smelled of recycled air, and legal liability, personnel with recording devices and classification protocols extracting every detail of Kel's 40-year presence while simultaneously denying that presence had occurred. The paradox of being interrogated about events that officially never happened, creating surreal exhaustion where truth and secrecy collapsed into each other, until I could barely remember which parts I was supposed to acknowledge and which required performative ignorance. They offered compensation that felt like hush money, legal documents that promised financial security in exchange for silence we were required to maintain. Regardless, the transaction unnecessary except as bureaucratic ritual to formalize what armed presence had already established. We would not speak of this, would not seek contact or information about Kel's fate, would return to lives that pretended the impossible hadn't occurred in our barn for decades. My father signed without reading, his grief too profound for outrage at institutional appropriation of relationship that had sustained him through isolation they could never understand, and I added my signature beside his, complicit in erasure because resistance was futile and Cale was already gone beyond any retrieval our cooperation or defiance could affect. They left finally, black vehicles disappearing down our road for last time, and we were released back into lives that felt emptied of significance, the barn standing silent and accusatory, reminder of absence that had replaced presence, and my father seemed to age. Years in the weeks that followed, as if Kel's departure had severed tether that had been keeping him anchored to continued existence, purpose draining away now that protection was no longer needed and companionship was reduced to memory and enforced silence. I stayed through autumn, unable to return to city life that felt trivial compared to what I'd witnessed, and watched my father navigate grief that had no socially acceptable outlet, no funeral or mourning rituals for loss of alien companion, no support systems for trauma of government seizure of 4-decade friendship. His sorrow forced into same hiding that had concealed Kel's existence. Invisible and unacknowledged, we didn't discuss what had happened, some unspoken agreement that words would diminish rather than illuminate. But I'd find him standing in the barn at odd hours, hand resting against wood where Cale had sheltered, and I understood he was maintaining vigil for relationship that couldn't be publicly mourned, keeping faith with connection that others would dismiss as delusion if we dared to speak it. He died that winter, peacefully in sleep. And I told myself it was natural age and accumulated years rather than heartbreak. But I knew the truth, knew that Kel's departure had severed something essential, that my father had been held together by purpose and companionship that institutional machinery had extracted along with the being he'd protected, leaving only shell that gradually stopped functioning. Once reason for continued function was removed, I buried him on the property with views of mountains where he'd found Cale 40 years earlier. Small ceremony attended by neighbors who knew him as reclusive rancher rather than guardian of impossible secret. And as I stood beside fresh grave I felt anger finally breaking through grief. Rage at government that had taken both alien and human through their intervention. At systems that recognized only threat and asset. At world that had no space for miracles that didn't fit established categories. At my own for decades of estrangement that had stolen time I could have spent understanding rather than judging as isolation. and strangeness. I intended to sell the property and return to city, to resume life interrupted by deathbed confession, an impossible revelation, but found myself unable to leave, drawn repeatedly to the barn that had housed secret and miracle, walking familiar space where Cale had lived hidden and protected, trying to sense some residue of presence that had altered my father's entire existence and transformed my understanding of reality. In single night of contact and revelation, months passed in strange suspension, winter releasing into spring, and I maintained the property through habit and inability to imagine alternative, going through motions of rural life my father had established while knowing I was really just prolonging connection to events I couldn't process or release, keeping vigil for loss I couldn't name. It was late May evening, light lasting long into twilight hours, when I walked to the barn carrying same restless grief that had driven me there countless times since my father's death, and saw immediately that something had changed. Mark on the wooden wall where Cale had spent so many years, symbol burned or etched into grain with precision that suggested deliberate creation rather than accident or natural pattern, design that definitely hadn't been present during my previous visit just days earlier. I approached with heart accelerating, hand extended toward Mark that seemed to shimmer slightly in fading light, symbol composed of curved lines and geometric patterns that conveyed meaning beyond mere decoration. And as my fingers made contact, I felt sudden flash of recognition, not vision like Cale had transmitted, but intuitive understanding that bypassed conscious translation, knowledge arriving complete and whole. The symbol meant I was never alone, and neither are you. Message and visual language that transcended words. Final communication from being I'd touched once and lost. Reassurance transmitted across whatever distance now separated. U.S. Proof that connection survived separation and love persisted beyond government intervention and mem. Ori lived in more than just human consciousness carrying it forward. I stood there as twilight deepened into darkness, hand pressed against symbol that shouldn't exist, gift from impossible source, and felt grief transforming into something else. Not relief or closure, but continuation. Understanding that what my father and Cale had shared wasn't ended by seizure and death, but translated into different form, persisting in marks on wood and changes in people who'd witnessed impossible friendship, rippling forward through time in ways institutional machinery couldn't capture or contain. Movement drew my attention upward, lights appearing in darkening sky, not stars or satellites or aircraft but something else. Patterns of luminescence moving with intention and intelligence, dancing above Montana mountains in configurations that suggested communication or celebration or recognition. And I understood with certainty beyond logic that Cale's people had received the warnings, had stayed away as intended, but were acknowledging the one who'd sacrificed reunion to protect both species, honoring 40 years of exile and love that had bridged difference, and perhaps acknowledging me as well. The daughter who'd witnessed final hours and carried forward story that couldn't be officially told, but wouldn't be forgotten. And I stood watching lights until they faded with approaching dawn, then turned back toward symbol burned in wood, toward house and land and life that had become mine through inheritance and choice. Understanding finally that my father's isolation had been purpose and Cale's exile had been love, and my own unexpected remaining was continuation of protection and witness. Keeping faith with impossible friendship by staying, by remembering, by maintaining space where miracle had occurred, and might yet occur again, by refusing to let institutional erasure be final word on connection that had transformed everyone it touched, by holding vigil in barn, where being from dying world had found family and human rancher had found meaning, and estranged daughter had found truth that shattered, and rebuilt understanding of what was possible. When fear was overcome and otherness was met with shelter rather than violence, alone but never alone, waiting beneath Montana sky for whatever came next, guardian, now of story and space and symbol that said love survives everything, even stars and silence and the vast empty distances between understanding. What would you protect if you knew the cost was everything you had? Subscribe to witness more encounters that challenge what it means to be human.